Okay, so we're going to talk about unboxing the wiring kit for your Transit here. So it'll be in a box that looks just like this. Should be labeled in front so you know exactly what's going on. These are basically going to be every single electrical component for the most part that's in the kit. So when you get into it, you'll pull out the two wiring looms themselves. So these are the two cabin harnesses. One will be labeled passenger side, one will be labeled driver's side. You can set that aside. After that, you'll have this thing that says E12 USB-T. These are the splitters that get put onto the particular wire drops for your outlets. All right, so you can set those aside as well. Aux cap bag. You know, this is actually to cap off the auxiliary wire drops that aren't being used for anything particular in the kit. So if you don't have any plans for those particular auxiliary drops, you won't. You'll end up capping those off with the contents of that package. All right. EFBB. This is your breaker. All right. So, or I'm sorry. This is your fuse block. All right. So this is kind of the central hub where everything comes into play. That's going to be mounted up on top of your driver's side B pillar. All right. And then all of the particular fuses that you'll use for this fuse block are also inside this bag. All right. EUSBOB, that's the outlets, USB outlets, of which you'll have 5. You'll also have your 12-volt outlets, you'll have 5 of those. Zip ties, this just helps you route the wiring throughout the van. We'll get into that when we actually do the wiring install. And this is your particular battery connect bag. All right, so this is going to have your breaker in it and your 4-gauge positive and negative cable leads to get power from the vehicle's battery. Okay, so we're going to start with the driver's side wiring loom, and we're going to start right here at this corner, kind of above the driver's side B pillar. This is the best place to start because this is where your fuse box is going to live. It's going to basically be mounted right here. So the name of the game is to start to run wiring backwards, kind of let this dangle. These are going to be the connections for the fuse block for now. So you can actually kind of tuck where it all connects here, and there's this heat shrink and it all comes out into the fuse block connections. You can kind of tuck this up here for now. There's other holes, you can zip tie it, and it's okay because we're going to need to readdress this later on anyway. But the point is, we're trying to start to move the wiring harness back into these voids to find the specific holes that allow us to drop them down lower in the van, kind of behind the scenes. And right here is going to be one of the thermoform trim pieces, and until you get to about this line here, this panel wants to lay pretty flat against the wall here, so you don't have a whole lot of room to lay wiring behind this. So just when you're going through all this and kind of doing the problem solving, just keep that in mind. You start to get more room to work with right about at this line where that trim piece is going to step off of the wall a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to just start with a zip tie here. There's a tiny little hole kind of where this pinch weld is, and I'm just trying to hold this in place for now. So I'm going to wrap it through the hole, get the wiring loom in there, and just zip tie it in place to hold it there for now. Okay, so we're going to start off with one of the more difficult wiring drops, and what makes it difficult is basically finding the access point to drop it down this B pillar and have it come out down low for the first outlet. So you're looking for basically the longest drop right after where the wiring loom kind of splits off into the fuse block, and you're going aft, and there's this one kind of long one, and it says B pillar plugs 15 amp. So that's one we're looking for, and what we're going to do is actually bring it into this void back here. You can use this little access hole here, but it's kind of sharp. There is protective looming, so you don't need to worry about it too much, but it's just as good. You can kind of bring it back into this bigger void, and you're just basically running it back here. And there's a lot going on back here, and it's kind of mostly just feeling your way through it until you find the right access hole that's going to route the wire down that B pillar. Okay, so I just ran the wiring in through this hole, and there's kind of a lot going on back here. You're looking for one particular, oh God! All right, there's one particular hole that you're looking for. I don't really know how to explain it. It's kind of just a trial and error thing. And it can either, if you get the wrong access point, it can move forward into the van into sort of a nothingness void back there. It can kind of stay looped up in this area if you find another wrong access point, but then the right one, you'll start to feel the loom wanting to route downward. And as you keep feeding it in, you shouldn't feel the wiring loom bunch up or anything like that. It should just continue to feed through until you see it pop out the bottom square here. Okay, so that particular hole that you're looking for, if you kind of lay your hand flat at the bottom, kind of, I guess you call it like the floor of this particular void, and run it forward until you start to feel an opening. The opening is kind of the first one you feel, and it comes backward into sort of a V shape, and stick the end of the wiring down there. And before you start, if you take the end of the wiring and sort of bend it into a curve, it'll help turn that corner and start going straight down. And then as you start feeding it down, like I said, you'll feel it continue to go downward and not bunch up at all. Actually hear it. You can hear the wiring loom. Look, it actually poked out here. So be careful of that too. Put it back into its hole and keep feeding it down. And then be watching for it to pop out. All right, we're gonna start working our way backwards along the wiring chase here. I allowed myself a little slack where we zip tied it up front to start, so that this particular bundle here where they put this heat shrink in is a little bit aft of this rib, just to give me a little bit more of a pliable kind of bundle to work with, because these are always the pinch points here underneath the rib where it meets up with our wire chase. And then the next drop off of that loom is going to be for the lights. So that one's actually running up. You can just tuck it up over the ceiling bracer, because we're going to connect that to our light panel later on. And then we're just going to continue to run backwards. And then where you can, you know, like I said, these are the pinch points, but you can share the wire chase with the factory harness as much as possible. And right here, I ended up really kind of pushing the factory harness back into that trough, so it's kind of tight fit in there, but it gives room for this, which is nice. So the next wire drop here is the C-pillar plugs, 15 amp. This one's going to come down the C-pillar and pop out down low in front of this this Z-line here. So where that splits off from the harness is right here. There's an access hole to get you into this void just behind the wire chase here. So you kind of stick the end in there until you see it come out through there. And could you hold this side? Thanks. Yep. Pull it through. And then we'll come back through and probably run some zip ties just to hold everything up here. And then this is going to be the next one that we have to find an access hole to drop down this C-pillar. Okay, a couple things. If you haven't already, this is a great time to put on your gloves. As you start running more wires, there's lots of little sharp things to cut yourself on. So put your gloves on. We also put a little zip tie up here to hold our harness up against this ceiling rib to keep it from wanting to slide out and fall down. So just getting rid of that zip tie. And then now we're going to take that C-pillar drop that I mentioned, and we're going to find the access hole to drop it down here. This is another pretty tricky one. It's a small little void that you have to find and route through. Okay, so same thing. Turn the end of the wiring a little bit, kind of so that when you hook it down in that hole, it'll want to follow through. And then again, run your hand along the base of this particular void here, back this way until you feel the first little opening. And it's just sort of a flat edge, and it's a small opening, but it's basically the first one that your hand hits, and that's where you're gonna run your wiring through. And then start running it down. You'll probably see it poke out in here if you're looking. Yep, there it is right there. So if you see that and it wants to loop back this way, stick your other finger in here and get it to follow the inside of this channel here. start running it down. Feels like it's getting pushed up a little bit. You can kind of jingle it around sometimes and get it to break loose. And then when it feels like you don't have much wire left to run through, sometimes you can reach back up here. If you kind of follow this corner up into this void, you can hear it bouncing around. And I got my hand on it and pulled it the rest of the way through this void here. Okay, so moving back, we got our C-pillar drop down there where it needs to be. Running our wiring loom along the top of the wire chase here. The next one that you'll see, it says aux 3. It's going to be capped off with a little bit of heat shrink here. This is just ready to be tapped into later on. If you want to put a reading light up here or something like that that needs 12 volt power, you'll just need to take off this wall panel when the time comes to get access to this, cut in whatever apparatus you need, and just plug in the wiring and then fuse it properly back at the fuse block, which will be labeled. So anyway, for now we're just going to basically tuck it behind the scenes. You can find one of these little access holes behind your wire chase here to drop it into one of these voids. We'll come back through later on with some hush mat or something like that to secure it to the van body so you don't hear it rattling and stuff. But for now we're just going to tuck it here. Out of the way. And then we've got 2 drops left. The shorter one is for the rear lights, so we'll probably run another zip tie up here to hold this tight up against here. So the light wiring, you want to at least get it aft of this ceiling rib, which is rib number 3, before you start running it over the speed strut. But you can do it over the speed strut here, kind of where this rear fan is. Let it hang out there, and then, you know, if it needs to run back here where the light connection is, there's a little kind of pocket that's created by this ceiling rib. You could also keep going backwards along the wire chase till you get aft of rib number 4 and then cut it over the ceiling bracer and then towards the middle of the van. And then after that, it's just running the last outlet drop on the D-pillar. Okay, now that the wiring loom is a little bit thinner, we only have 2 wires that we're worrying about, and there's no more splits. A good way to kind of keep this wiring harness from, you know, competing for real estate with the factory wiring is there's a little access hole where the ceiling rib meets the wall up here, and it comes through here, comes back out the same hole in behind it, and you can kind of loop it up through there. And it'll kind of keep the wiring in place where it needs to be, and like I said, give you more space to work with. Okay, we're gonna end up kind of getting this factory harness cleaned up a little bit and out of the way. But I want to get the wire end through this hole up here or that hole. We're trying to get it behind the scenes into this void first. So run it through there. Okay, and then there's another access hole. It's kind of along the back wall here to get it into the D-pillar and run down. Basically, once it gets in there, it's kind of following the factory harness, but there's a little hole right there. I don't know if you can see my finger, okay?
Take your finger out of it.
Right there. And then I'm gonna start the wiring just like we did, sort of turning it downward. And start feeding it through there. If you feel it get hung up on the factory harness or anything back there, kind of back it out a little bit. Maybe twist it in your fingers or something like that to try to sort of redirect it slightly. And just continue to feed it down in there. I can see it moving. You can come in from this side, you can come down under this if you need to. Doesn't really matter too much. The outlet's going to be right about here. You have a little bit more wire than you need, but that's fine. You know, you can snip it and re-tape it if you want to do that. You can just kind of loop up the wiring to save yourself some space if you want to do that. It's whatever works. And then this is what we're going to crimp onto the outlets. So we're done running the driver's side wiring loom. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do here's kind of the first break in this wiring loom. So it's where everything comes back from the fuse block again, and there's this piece of heat shrink, and that's kind of where stuff starts to divide from there. We're actually going to start there, and we're going to zip tie it up above this pinch weld kind of shelf here. There's another hole, just like on the driver's side. There's another hole that we can run a zip tie through to hold it in place. So we're going to kind of run it up over there. Steve's going to come in with a zip tie and run it up through the hole. And then we're going to kind of tuck it back in there. And you don't need to go super tight with this. You can tighten it later if you need to, but it's good to allow a little bit of slack so you can manipulate the harness back and forth if you need to. Next thing we're going to do is take a panel removal tool, and there's some retaining clips on the top of this headliner here. We need to bring the headliner down, or at least be able to kind of bend it down to get access behind there, because this wiring loom is going to follow kind of the backside of this ceiling rib. So if you're shorter, you know, this is a little bit harder task. You need a stool or something, but look for the clips, and they're orange, and they're holding that on, and kind of wedge this over it and pull the clip down. Sometimes takes a little bit of finagling. All right, so that's kind of playing a little bit. That's what those orange clips look like. Make sure that they don't break and stay in the van. You kind of need to get your tool in between the actual painted van body and the clip itself, the orange flange of the clip. That's the best way to do it without breaking them. Okay, so now we're going to run the wiring loom kind of across basically the top of the headliner here, so we can kind of pull it down. And for now, I'm actually keeping it in front of the little clippy-doos here and just kind of resting it along this sort of lipped edge of the headliner itself. We'll come back through and secure it if need be, just to keep it from bouncing around. But just make sure that when we get to the end here, and we'll probably readdress this, that the wiring loom is following this corner and tucking up in there nicely, and then the ends are ready to connect to our fuse block. Okay, so keep in mind your fuse block is going to live in this area, and so basically it's about the size of my hand actually, and it's going to kind of post up here. You can kind of tilt it as necessary, but the reason I'm saying that is you just want to make sure that you have enough wire to work with here, but not too much. You know, you don't want to have 2 feet worth of wire, but you also don't want to have only this much sticking out from behind your headliner, if you can see that. Just enough wire to actually be manipulated and connected to the fuse block. All right, at this point, we're back to this sort of split. There's 3 different splits coming off of this. The first one is a relatively short one. That's for the front fan. That's going to end up running over this first ceiling rib and into this first ceiling bay. This particular van is not getting a front fan though, so I'm just going to tuck that out of the way for now, because we're not even going to use it. We'll cap it off later. The next one is actually an auxiliary. It's another auxiliary drop. Anytime you see auxiliary, you'll probably see that it's got some shrink wrap on the end of it, and it just means it's ready to be tapped into, just like on the driver's side, but we're not using it for anything in particular on this build. So we can just kind of loop it up and consolidate it a little bit, and we can tuck it back in here for now. And again, we'll readdress that when we come back through with hush mat and insulation, just kind of keep it in place there. And then we'll start to move backward with our remaining wiring loom. Probably gonna want to use a zip tie right here to keep it tucked nice and tight up into the corner here. Since we don't have a wire chase that comes as far forward as this, we'll just zip tie it up into this corner. Thanks. Do that better later.
It's a long one.
And then continue moving backward and we start to interact with our wire chase here on the passenger side. So if need be, you can get another zip tie up in here. Sometimes it's really helpful actually, because it just helps keep the weight of the loom from wanting to pull it back out this way. So it just sort of holds it in place there. So we'll zip tie that and then continue with the other wiring drops. All right, so we're gonna actually drop this one. The rest of this rectangular cutout is actually, it leaves us access behind the wire chase here. So we can kind of just tuck it behind there and it'll come out there. Okay, and then this side here, again, you kind of run your hand on the base of this cavity here, and there's some smaller holes. But if you run it forward until you basically get to the edge where you feel this big void, and if you can look in there, I mean, you can see it. It's a little easier on this side. And then start your wiring down into there. You can see it through this hole. And again, you're trying to follow it down the curvature of the front of this window bay here, and make sure it doesn't poke out one of those little holes here. All right, down here, the structures behind the scenes get a little bit more complicated. It's a little bit different from the driver's side. So the wire might find its way kind of behind a little separation back there that wants to push it this way, and there's a smaller access hole to allow it to do that. Or if it's forward of that, it's gonna come down kind of basically right behind our orange bracer and end out here. Either way is fine, because we're just trying to get into this general area and there's enough wire to work with. So as you start dropping it down, try to see if you can figure out where it's coming out, and you might need to try to feel around with your fingers up in there to feel the wiring loom. So I kind of went back to the top and fed it up and down a few times, and then just kind of kept feeding it in there. And then in this particular case, kind of followed, you can hear that, I sort of followed my hand forward until I felt the void and reached up in there, and I could feel the end of the wiring. So we don't have a wire to work with, so we'll get back to that. Okay, so we're moving backwards. There's a couple more splits to address here. The first one would be the rear fan. This is another good one, because since the rear fan lives in bay number 3, or behind the third rib at least, get that up through the ceiling rib here, and it just kind of keeps it up and out of the way. I mean, you could run it through the wiring chase as well. It's really either way works fine. But it kind of gets it up and holds it tight in there, and then it's going to end up over here. All right, I'm just going to tuck it out of the way so we don't hit our heads on it for now. Oh, that's good. All right, and then we've got another auxiliary. All right, this says auxiliary 1. Again, it's capped off, so you know it's just ready to be used later on. You can, bundle it up or wrap it up, tuck it behind here. You can put it in this forward one, whichever one you think you might use, and that's fine. We're not going to address that right now. And that leaves the last wire drop, which is the rear outlet here. So rear plugs, 15 amp. It's a big long one, and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did on the driver's side. In this case, we're going to run it up through this kind of square hole. And then through the little circular hole, it's kind of in the same exact place as it was on the driver's side. Again, it's sometimes helpful to, bend the wires and start to turn them downward a little bit to start running it. Okay, this one was a little bit tricky. Some of the other factory wiring was kind of holding it up a little bit, but reached back up in there, jiggled the wire from the top a little bit so I could figure out where it was. And now pulling it out. Here we go.